Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning. Let me first introduce our panelists for this session. John Feely is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department. Arturo Sarucán is Chairman of Global Solutions, a Podesta company. He is a former Mexican ambassador to the United States. Duncan Wood, on my far left, the Director of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and Jorge Suárez Vélez, founding partner of SP Capital and author of Ahora o Nunca, Now or Never, Mexico's Great Opportunity to Grow, a seminal book on Mexico's current potential. I beg each of you, as you well know, to keep your answers brief. Let's begin. There seems to be two opposing narratives when it comes to Mexico at the beginning of the Peña Nieto government. One comes from outside the country, and it is very optimistic. People like Shannon O'Neill or Thomas Friedman insist that Mexico has come a long way from the days of the priest's perfect dictatorship, as Vargas Llosa called the party's uninterrupted 70-plus year reign. They also say Mexico is now poised to finally claim its place as an economic powerhouse, especially if the Peña Nieto government delivers on reform. The opposing view is mainly Mexican. Shannon O'Neill's optimistic book, for example, has been panned as ill-informed and naive. And Friedman was not only dismissed, but also ridiculed, actually ridiculed, by Mexican pundits who claimed he became a pampered tourist in Monterrey who left his journalistic integrity somewhere on the plane from JFK. For these people, Mexico is far from an ascendant economic power. Actually, they say the country is not even on the right track. And I'm not exaggerating. So let me begin by asking, which of these narratives is true? Is Mexico an ascendant economic power, or is it still a country paralyzed by deep structural problems? And please don't take the easy way out and say that it's a little bit of both, because I think we would all agree that there is no such thing as a promising failure. So whoever wants to start, John, maybe you?
Sure. Let me go ahead and jump in. And let me say unabashedly that I will come down very strong on the side of Shannon O'Neill and on the side of Tom Friedman and on the side of many of us in the Department of State and the Obama administration. And our cheerleading is not without substance. It is supported by the number of hard facts and data that over the last 25 years show that Mexico is a country that is on the right path. It has more free trade agreements than any other country in the hemisphere. It is absolutely inextricably bound up with the gas that you put in your cars, the food you eat on your tables, the very people who live next to you in your neighborhoods. It is undertaking now with Peña Nieto a continuing succession of reforms. The reform passed on telecoms to break up some of the monopolistic way in which a juggernaut of a sector has been controlled. The reforms on education. Mexico has problems. I mean, it is a little bit of both, and we all know it. However, undeniably, I would have to say, having lived in Mexico as a diplomat on two separate occasions, it is ascendant. It already is an international economic juggernaut. I think it's the 12th or 13th largest GDP in the world. And while the picture may be complex, the future, I think, is certainly bright. And let me just finish by saying that I've had the privilege of living and working in a number of Latin American countries, and in all of them, I would say that más que nadie, el mexicano es desconfiado. Mexicans themselves seem to have an almost perverse love of criticizing themselves. And so I think that's why you get in maybe the boardroom of La Jornada or in the faculty lounge of the UNAM, you get a lot of self-loathing that comes out in elite circles. But outside that, I think Mexico is very promising. I think it's doing a lot of things, and I think it's going to continue being an absolutely essential and strategic partner for the United States.
Is it a case of self-loathing then?
I don't know if it's self-loathing. I think that Mexicans have a good reason to question the cyclical parading of Mexico's wares in the international arena, because so many times those promises have been unfulfilled. But I think there is a fundamental shift, Leon. I think that the homework that Mexico has been doing, at least consistently, especially in the macroeconomic area, for the past 4 administrations, Cedillo, Fox, Calderón, and now Peña Nieto, is starting to develop a huge potential. I do understand many Mexicans riffing on British historian A.G.P. Taylor's famous quip that Mexico is always at a turning point in history, but history actually never turns. And you know, it's understandable that many in Mexico feel that way, but I do think that if you look at the numbers, some of them that John has mentioned, if you look at the potential of what I think is the most important success story behind NAFTA, we're about to reach the 20-year anniversary of NAFTA, and one of the dirty little secrets of NAFTA is that it has, to the extent that you don't see in any other economic bloc on the face of the earth, you see integrated supply and production chains, which are completely changing not only the economic footprint in Mexico, but the ability of North America to compete. You're looking at one of the most astounding and important expansions of a middle class anywhere on the face of the earth. You don't have to be a rocket scientist, and sorry, I'm going to plug an American company. I don't represent them, so I'm not spinning their wares, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why Best Buy has the largest store in terms of square feet on the face of the earth in Mexico City. There's an expanding middle class. There's a fundamentally changing demographic curve in Mexico. The birth rate in the US was 2.4 last year, Mexico's was 2.2.
People would tell you, but there's inequality.
That is there.
Poverty.
That is there. That's one. There are two pigs that you can't put lipstick on in Mexico. One is the challenge of endemic corruption, which is a huge challenge, and it's one of the reasons why the previous administration and now this administration have committed to enhance the rule of law, to strengthen institutions, to enhance human security. And the other one is extreme poverty and inequality. Latin America is not the poorest region in the world, but it is the most unequal region in the world. But even despite that, Leon, Oportunidades, this I think landmark signature Mexican program that was launched in the 90s and that has been perfected by consecutive Mexican administrations, a conditional cash transfer program that provides the female head of household with access to cash. This has become a program that has brought 40 million people out of extreme poverty in Mexico. So no, we have not turned the page. This isn't rosy and peachy, but I think the structural pillars that you see in Mexico are fundamentally changing the ability of Mexico for the first time in its history to start punching above its weight in the international arena.
How important is it for Mexico to reach its potential that the Peña Nieto government delivers on reform?
I think it's very important. I think that the way that I would see it is that Mexico has, at this moment, a unique opportunity, basically because, as we've seen, China is changing its economic model, relying less on investment and exports and more into consumption. To do that, they have to strengthen their currency. They have to increase salaries domestically. The difference in salaries between Mexico and China 10 years ago was salaries in Mexico were 237% higher. Now they're 7% higher, which does not justify 21 days by ship. Shipping things from China to the United States. I think that the reality here is that a lot of things have been done. It's a fact that Mexico today graduates more engineers than Germany, the United States, or Brazil. It's a fact that the other day I was listening to the president of Volkswagen saying the best plant that we have in the world is the Puebla plant. It rivals German plants in terms of errors per car. They said the only reason why we're actually opening a plant in the United States is not because we prefer it, but because we're relying too much on Mexico. It's strategically absurd. Mexico is proving that it can do a lot of things right. It has. It's for me, it's very shocking to hear time and again that people say, "Oh, but Colombia is such a great story. You know, Peru, they're doing everything right. Chile is amazing." Mexico City has a larger economy than Chile. Colombia, I mean, all the highways of four lanes.
And it's safer than Washington, D.C., right?
And it's safer.
Absolutely.
Mexico City is safer than Washington, D.C. All the highways that are 4 lanes in Colombia would not be able to make the distance between Mexico City and Acapulco. And Mexico has built infrastructure, has done a lot of things right. But I think that, just commenting on this self-loathing, and I think one of the biggest problems that Mexico has is that it keeps comparing itself with the United States. So it keeps thinking but they're doing better. They have better infrastructure. They have nice universities. Yes, and one of the advantages I think of Chile is that their neighbor is Argentina. No, so it's a very nice comparison. No, but I think that yes, not only the reforms have to be accomplished. I think. Trying to wrap up and not to extend myself too much. I think the main issue that I see today is that if you read the other day the FT and listened to what German industrial CEOs were saying is, if the United States goes through the shale gas revolution, there's no way that Germany can compete with the United States because of the cost of energy that this country will have. Today, at board meetings in Stuttgart or Munich, they're discussing how they're going to move their capacity to this side of the ocean. But their question is, do I do it in a right-to-work state of the United States, or do I do it in Mexico? The one missing link, in my opinion, in Mexico is still making sure that you have availability of energy, and that it's energy that's not dependent on the government, but is depending on private agreements. If Mexico manages, for instance, an energy reform, I think we're going to see very high levels of growth in Mexico that are very important. Once we do that, another huge question is going to be, how can we take Mexico's imprint in the United States from having less to do with drug dealing and immigration and much more to do with the importance of the partnership that we have? That's a different topic. But the first thing we do need is reforms.
You open the door to the elephant in the room, in every room in Mexico, which is energy reform. So before Peña Nieto got elected, people close to him actually did circle the globe promising that Pemex would finally open its doors to private and foreign investments. Mexico's untouchable goddess, that's what Lula calls Pemex. So the Peña Nieto government says it will open up Pemex. Early summer, they said, referring to energy reform. Duncan, this is a topic that you know a lot about. Do you see that happening? What would Mexico lose if it failed to pass energy reform? Really ambitious energy reform.
Yeah, I would say that this is really the pivotal issue that's coming up in Mexico. It matters in so many different ways. The good news that's been coming out of Mexico on the economic front, on the reform front, slightly tempered obviously by the negative news which is coming out in the press in recent days on violence and security cooperation with the United States. But that wave of good news has kept going because it's been success after success after success. And a lot of that has been founded around this political arrangement that exists in Mexico called the Pacto por Mexico, an agreement between the three main parties, their elites, to come together, to hash things out in the Congress, and to basically present to their representatives, their legislative representatives, a deal which they can then vote on. Now that's been incredibly successful over the past 5 months in generating agreement on the questions of education, labor, telecoms. We're going through the discussions right now over a financial reform. But most people on the inside say it's doubtful that agreement can survive the negotiation of an energy reform that involves a constitutional change. I don't think it's going to be in the early summer. I mean, I really think it's going to be...
early summer 2016, maybe?
No, I think we're looking at... it's going to start in August. At some point between August and December, that's when it's going to happen. The timing of it will depend on a number of factors. It's when they can actually reach some kind of agreement with the major partner, which will be the PAN, the center-right party. It's when they can time it perfectly so that there's an upswell of public opinion believing that there's a fundamental challenge, problem in the oil sector. Now, if that is timed right, and if they go for the ambitious reform, as Jorge has just said, it opens the door for all kinds of positive things to happen afterwards. If it fails for some reason, or if the government decides to put on the table a less ambitious reform which doesn't really do what's needed, and there's a very important point here. I think a lot of Mexicans believe that foreign investors are desperate to dash into Mexico and take advantage of all of these resources. Well, they are if the opportunity is right, if the conditions are right, if the contracts are designed in a certain way, if the legal framework is in place, if there's a regulator there. If the government doesn't do this right, I think there's going to be an incredibly disappointing reaction to the energy reform. And that's why it's so crucial that they get all of the technical side of things right now, as well as the political negotiations with the key partners. So I actually see this as being pivotal. It's one of the issues that could really damage the reputation of the current administration.
Can I very quickly add, I think that what's at stake here with energy reform in Mexico, energy reform is the big carrot in the room to re-energize the strategic edifice of North America. If Mexico gets energy reform right, this will completely change the dynamics of North America. For starters, imagine what happens if overnight we add shale capabilities of gas and oil from Mexico to what you already have in the US and in Canada. Overnight, North America becomes the #1 producer of oil on the face of the earth. The United States today is talking about its geopolitical realignment in the world. If you want a geopolitical realignment, just think what energy independence, energy efficiency, and energy security in North America does to that. So beyond how important this is domestically for Mexico, because it is from energy and the energy sector that Mexico will have the ability to tap into the resources that it needs to invest in education and human capital and to continue to modernize infrastructure. This is the game changer for the relationship with our two North American partners.
Can I add to that? Sorry. I think that actually I cannot agree more with Arturo, and I would say that I said the same in the book, but then I remember that I quoted you in the book saying it, so, so it's like I'm cheating. But I think that the big issue here is that yesterday in the panel that you moderated, right, I think it was in a room in front of us, Carlos Elizondo said that the biggest predictor of growth in Mexico is what is happening with manufacturing in the United States. What Arturo is saying, I think, has a multiplier effect, which is that, first, I think that what this energy alliance can do is it can, again, offer a restart of the corporate relationship between Mexico and the United States, because there would be a lot of partnership between both countries. But secondly, I think that would mean that the big advantage the United States has because of access to cheap energy, that will restart its manufacturing capacity, and it's the best thing that can happen to the unemployment problem in the United States. It can be strongly beneficial for Mexico because both countries have been integrating their manufacturing production for 20 years already. Mm-hmm. The Mexican component of U.S. manufactured products is close to 35%, something like that. So in that sense, I think that the opportunity to restart in many ways this relationship is given by this. So it's I think it's and just commenting on what you said, I could not agree more that the main risk is not no reform. The main risk is a bad reform, mm-hmm. because then they will say, oh, we already did it. No, and then the government will start defending what was done. And then many people will say, see, I told you this kind of policies did not work because the result was not satisfactory. They'll never see, well, the reform was not satisfactory. So I think that's a huge risk.
Let me rain on our parade a little bit. I think that it's easier said than done, John. This reform, I think of it usually as the Mexican version of gun control in the United States, because Mexican politics have been kidnapped by a minority for a while now. Are you worried that very, very vocal minority that basically caused a reform that was not the one that was needed to be passed in the previous government, are you worried that minority might take over again the Mexican political landscape? And I'm obviously referring to mm-hmm. to the radical left, if we could the mm-hmm. populist left.
Well, look, you make a good point about democracy in general. In the United States, we have just come through a very traumatic period with regard to gun control. And this is not a partisan position on either side, but you heard what the president said. This was not going to be the end of it. And you've already got sponsors coming back at the table. And you've got a very polarized debate in Congress with numbers that everybody can use to support their arguments. Mm-hmm. I think it's a process. And I think the same thing will happen in Mexico. Yes, you have got, as Mexico's democracy has grown, has become genuine, has become more than just a perfect dictatorship and one-party control, you have various factions. What I think ultimately will happen there is that you're going to get empowered citizens, and they will drive those electors. I mean, right now you still have planchas, plurinominal people in Mexico's Congress. And that may or may not be a political reform at some point in the future. But undeniably, if you go back and you look at Mexico 30, 35 years ago, the amount of responsibility that an individual legislator felt to his or her constituency has grown enormously today. There are legislators who now in Mexico, in both the Senate and the House, have módulos de atención ciudadana, little sort of vans that drive around, park in a plaza. And
but re-election was
there.
defeated. Legislative
No,
re-election
but
was defeated.
all I'm saying is that these are examples of the types of changes that can happen, but over time. So I think we have to be a little bit careful, and I will sort of moderate my enthusiasm by saying that none of this is going to happen tomorrow. I don't think that any of the energy changes will happen overnight. I think it will be a process. And all I'm saying is that the underlying trends are positive in terms of that process becoming more democratic, more responsive to what average citizens need. I mean, most Mexicans, if you ask them, would rather have greater options in what they watch on their handhelds, what they watch on their broadcast news, what they consume in terms of entertainment, etc. And they haven't had that option. They're captured by a company that's got almost 80% of the cellular telephony in Mexico, and they pay among the highest rates. The average citizen doesn't want that. The way they're going to change it in a democracy is through a process. I see the trends as positive.
So John is describing Mexico time. Is Mexico time good enough for the world? I know Mexico time. You know Mexico time. Is it good enough for the world?
I'm also describing U.S. time. Think about immigration
Unfortunately.
reform. Think about gun control. Think about, Obamacare was by standards in the United States. And again, this is not a partisan comment, but just by the standards of American legislation.
But you're not praising U.S. time now, are you?
No, what I'm saying is that all democracies are complicated, and Mexico time may be becoming more America time, and America time may be more Mexico time. Don't be so quick to assume that we've got to see the results tomorrow or even in the next quarter.
Don't we? When it comes to energy reform, honestly, don't we need that? Jorge was describing, and Duncan was describing how companies are interested in Mexico if things happen. But if they don't, or if they happen on Mexico time?
I think the democratic process and policy making in Mexico, but also in the United States and other countries, if you look at most Western democracies, I think you're seeing this trend. And that's why you have things like in this country, on both ends of the spectrum, an Occupy Wall Street and a Tea Party. Or in Israel, the students rising up, walking on the streets because of the cost of living. Or in Chile, some of the student movements that we've seen there in recent years. Spain with the Indignados movement. There's a growing challenge for Western democratic regimes to ensure that there's a conveyor belt between citizens and political parties and institutions. And I think that link in many countries is broken, and Mexico is not the exception. This country, you can see it all the time. So I do think, yes, I would agree with my former State Department colleague that yes, we have to.
He can actually speak freely today. I'm still trying to change.
Yes, we have to let some of these processes move forward and build momentum. But I do think that Mexico right now does face, I think Jorge's title for his book captures it. It's now or never. I think there is an issue of an opportunity, of a window that is open, because a number of things have lined up. And that's why you've got the narrative that you have on Mexico in the international press that's been building for over the past year. Because there's a momentum. A momentum has been building. A number of issues have lined up. There's a opportunity. There's a bit of a Nixon goes to China syndrome with a PRI president who can finally maybe deliver the PRI governors who for the past 12 years blocked any possibility of reforms and advance on a whole series of issues. So I think there is an opportunity, and I think that Mexico and Mexicans and Mexican political parties across the spectrum have to move now and fast.
I am not advocating China in this regard, but China time is different. I'm just being very pragmatic. When it comes to the economy, China time is different, no?
Yeah, I think it's always nice to be a dictatorship, right?
That's why I say I am not advocating it at all.
But yes, I think that following a little probably what John was saying, I think that there's plenty of academic study about the link between democracy and development. I think the counter side of the advantage is that yes, you move much more slowly, and yes, you have to sell to the people why things have to be done. But also, I think in the case of Mexico, something that is to which we do not give enough credit is, Mexico has become a capitalist country, where markets define where money goes, where the size of government relative to the economy is much more limited than even countries like Brazil. So in that sense, I think that I hope that in the long run, Mexico will be able to prove that this is a much better model than a centralized planning Chinese model, where I think that, for instance, way too much money was put into credit, into development of these ghost cities, into all these topics that are going to bite them further down the road. So I think in that sense, I think that what we need in the case of Mexico is to strengthen the democracy, to increase accountability, to build a stronger rule of law. In that sense, I think if Mexico manages to really become a much more institutional or a country with much more solid institutions, then I think that advantage with China is going to be further used.
Let me ask you about security. During the presidency of Felipe Calderón, the U.S. and Mexico went through an unprecedented era of cooperation. Now with the PRI, there have been reports, actually two very high-profile and consecutive pieces in both the LA Times and the New York Times 2 days ago, and I think today or yesterday, of a more guarded, even confrontational attitude coming from Mexico. A couple of days ago, in an interview for Univision, I asked John Feely about the LA Times piece. He said, and I quote, "The Peña Nieto government would like to have a bit more order as to what was honestly an improvised strategy." Arturo, you were part of Mexico's previous government. Was it an improvised strategy?
I don't think so. I don't think it was improvised. I think there was an important lack of coordination between the agencies that were working. By the way, on both sides of the border, we had lack of coordination in Mexico, and we had lack of coordination in some of the U.S. agencies that were working with their Mexican counterparts. It was a new paradigm of cooperation that had never existed before in the bilateral relationship. I think both sides were getting used to understanding how to develop this and deepen it. I do think that the security dialogue that we triggered with the United States, which is where I think some people have missed the point, is much broader than just drugs and thugs and border security. Yes, it was about enhancing the rule of law and enhancing human security in Mexico and ensuring that the border, by the way, in both directions, drugs moving in one, guns and bulk cash moving in the other, that we had better operational control of that border. But at the end of the day, what I think is the unique virtue of what developed is that Mexico and the United States, for the first time, have developed a new template to talk about regional and global security and intelligence issues which had never been part of the bilateral agenda. And for a country like mine, that I would like to see, as I said, punch above its weight in the international system, you can't continue to watch your belly button. Mexico has to assume the responsibilities in a post-9/11 world of being the neighbor of the United States, of having a 3,000-kilometer border with all the opportunities but also the vulnerabilities that a contiguous land border provides. And I think that, again, beyond the specific issue of counter-narcotics cooperation, what was developed was a new paradigm. It was sort of the other side of what NAFTA triggered 20 years ago, which was the economic and trade relationship, which is now blossoming. We had never had this level of political and security dialogue, which is now part of the equation. And that, I think, is the most important piece of what was developed these past 6 years.
Leon, I just want to comment on that, because I think it's crucial to remember that you've had a party that's come into power in Mexico that was out of power for 12 years. Now, a lot of the people that we are very familiar with on the economic side of the equation were very international. These were people who were engaged in the United States, many of them studied in the United States. Look at the people who came in on the security side in the Mexican government. These are people who came from a largely sort of state level, local level,
even
political
provincial
background, provincial level, if you like. They didn't have a lot of international experience. And when they come into power and they see all the things that are going on that have been created over the past 6 years in particular, they say, well, how do we get to this point? I mean, there's a process here of adjustment. There's a transition period that's going to take place. And like any bilateral relationship, when you see a change of government, the two sides have to come together and have to say, so what is it that we're both comfortable working together on? And I think that Arturo has said it very, very well here, which is that there's a number of issues that the two governments are discovering right now that they can actually work together on. One of them being Central America. I think Central America is going to be a crucial area of collaboration for the two countries in the coming years. We're seeing that obviously it's of great importance to Mexico to try to stabilize the region of Central America for a number of reasons, for migration, for organized crime, for public health issues, etc., and for the innate potential, economically speaking, of that region, where Mexican companies are really the dominant actors and have the opportunity to expand their markets. So I think that we're seeing that the two countries are coming together. Yeah, there's going to be tensions. Yes, there's going to be frictions because the new team in Mexico is not entirely comfortable with a lot of the things that have been put in place over the last 6 years. That's entirely understandable.
But are they uncomfortable with the United States or with the way the Calderón government did things? Very different.
I mean, John, go ahead.
I would argue it's the latter. And let me come back to the idea of improvisation. And let me say that I stand by that. And think about jazz. What does jazz do when you improvise? You've got a structure, you've got some basic chord progressions, and then you try different things. We had never, the United States, had never had the type of, what Arturo said about the relationship and the way in which it was a new paradigm is absolutely true. But it didn't happen from one day to the other. We sat down and we had government bureaucrats and we had people who were specialists in security. And now I'm just talking about the counter-narcotics aspect of it. And they sat down and they talked and then we implemented. And as we implemented, you know, a famous Prussian general once said, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy. We had to change, we had to evolve, we had to improvise. We realized that we had to create certain special vetted units. We realized that we had to pay more attention to supporting prosecutors. That's my reference to the word improvisation, that we had a dialogue just like two jazz musicians playing off one another, and we were able to, within a structure, remember, Merida cooperation has 4 pillars, Mexico under Calderón had its own strategy, Merida was not that strategy, it was much broader, and now what you're finding is, as Duncan I think says very aptly, is you've got a new team in, and you've got to give them some time to look at what was done. There was a good, but not a perfect transition in Mexico. I'm not certain that all of the folks who have come in with Peña Nieto from the State of Mexico government or from Osorio Chong, who's in the Secretario de Gobernación, had full deep briefings. And so that's what the importance of this president's visit is, because when big guys get together, all the little guys have to put stuff together, and that's how you get action galvanizing and forcing events. So I stand by the idea that it was improvised, but it was not sort of just ad hocery. There was a structure, there was a strategy, and I think it has been transformational. And we're going to have to see just what Peña Nieto is comfortable with. But right now, what we're comfortable with is giving them the time and the space to determine what they do in their own country.
One of my favorite phrases recently from Washington was, every week is Mexico week in Washington now. Because the level of interaction, the intensity of interaction is extraordinary. The number of high-level people who come in to visit and get high-level meetings with their counterparts in the U.S.
We're
government.
getting kind of tired of this thing here.
Yeah, I would. But it's
No,
extraordinary.
that's not true.
It's extraordinary because not every country gets that. I mean, I spent a lot of my life studying Canada, and Canada constantly complains that they can send cabinet-level ministers to Washington. Nobody wants to meet with them. But Mexico has this pull in Washington, and everybody recognizes the importance of it. And that's, I think, what's really going to pull everything through. It's the personal ties that are built up when people get together.
But I think that's exactly the opportunity. I mean, I'm not trying to be overly optimistic here, but I think that what is increasingly the case is that the southern border of North America is the Suchiate. I mean, the issues that both Mexico and the United States share are growing every day, and especially in what has to do with fighting crime. what you realize is that if there's persons of interest coming into Mexico to try to go into the United States, it is an issue for Mexico. What you realize is that if there is going to be any terrorists trying to come from the southern border, they will use routes that are currently used by smugglers in the border. What you realize is, as you were saying, I think Central America is of crucial importance, among other reasons, because if it's estimated by Stratfor, by some entities, that the drug trafficking between Mexico and the United States is about $40 billion a year, that's really not that much for a country that has $1.2 trillion GDP like Mexico, but that's larger than the GDP of Honduras. So those could become narco states. So it is of real importance that there's this cooperation, and I think that the fact that increasingly you're seeing that these Mexican gangs are having presence in the United States, are doing things with Maras in the United States, are doing things with Mexican-American bands in the United States. I think all these issues, I think in my opinion, make me more optimistic about what's going to come, because I think that cooperation has to happen.
The New York Times piece says, there have long been political sensitivities in Mexico over allowing too much American involvement, but the recent policy changes have rattled American officials, used to far fewer restrictions than they have faced in years. Both pieces, published recently, are far less optimistic than any of you. Worst case scenario, Arturo, is Plan Merida at risk? Senator Leahy has been holding up the $246 million that should be given to Mexico now. Is it worst case scenario at risk?
I will duck that question and probably formulate it this way. There's a lot of debate going on now, whether it's in the press, whether it's in corridors of power, in Washington, elsewhere, of whether and you like, as a journalist, you like this type of framing, so I'll try and do it for you. Whether it's a glass half empty or a glass half full. I think the glass
That's
is
cheap. I don't
I
like
think
that
the glass is I think the glass is
Come
being
on.
filled, Leon.
Okay,
I
that's
think
better.
I
That's
think
better.
the glass, it's not half empty, it's not it's not full, it's not half full, it's being, as we speak, it's being filled, it's being poured by the Mexican government. We have to give them the
Time.
breathing space to figure out what their priorities are, how they're going to put their, how they're going to set up their own mechanisms, and we have to give them some breathing space. I would certainly ask that of any new government, and I think it's we have to wait and see. I do believe, as I've said a few minutes ago, and as I was convinced as ambassador, that these two countries are joined at the hip for the good. And that developing this type of dialogue that we developed in the past, where we have deepened our understanding of how global and regional securities, global and regional security issues affect both countries, is a critical component of our agenda. So it has to be there. What shape, what color, what are the trends? We have to give them time to define those.
It took the Obama administration over 8 months to decide what it was going to do with Afghanistan policy. I think we are well within the expectations of reasonableness to be able to allow the United States and Mexico, and I think what you're going to see coming out of tomorrow's meeting and the day after is going to be a clearer definition of this. The other thing that I would say is that, as Arturo rightly puts his finger on it, we have continued this process, and what I would encourage everyone to do is look at trends. Don't necessarily look at the blips. Now, all of those journalists who wrote are excellent, and Arturo and I have spent much of our career as sources for them, as has Duncan. I mean, they are very well-informed people, but they sell newspapers and they sell newsprint by looking at the blips. Look at the overall trends on security, and I think you'll see reason for the optimism that we express.
Lower your expectations and adopt a long-term perspective.
That's what my dad said about me.
Before we open the floor for questions, I like to talk about immigration. Duncan, with negative net migration, zero or negative, historically low birth rates, as Arturo said, in Mexico, and a border that is more secure than it has ever been, why do American politicians, especially Republicans, one should say, keep talking about a third wave of immigrants or the dangers at the border? Is it mere pandering, or is there a real danger of? I know that there's no danger of a third wave of migrants because demographics don't lie. But is there real danger at the border? What is it with American politicians and this topic?
There's so many answers to this question that I don't know where to begin. I mean, there's obviously the political logic of the debate, which is that a lot of the people who are engaged in debating immigration reform in this country are responding not to long-term expectations because they have to think about the next election. They're calculating, where is my political benefit on this particular argument? If I am in favor of gaining the Latino vote in the long term, does that mean I have to sacrifice some of the anti-immigrant vote in the United States in the short term? That's a very delicate calculation for any politician. In terms of, is there going to be the third wave? I think there's an interesting answer to this, and you said you don't think there is because the demographics aren't there. Well, the demographics aren't there in Mexico, but in Central America, the demographics are certainly there still. And we're not going to see that human wave that we saw before, certainly. But think about a situation where economic growth picks up dramatically in the United States. Think about a situation where demand for labor picks up dramatically. And it's possible that we could see the numbers going up significantly, not in the way that we did over the last 20 years, but seeing how those numbers are being pulled up. Now, it all depends where the growth takes place. And we have to adopt a very nuanced approach here. Is the growth in the United States going to come in agriculture and the services sector? Is it going to come in the sort of more highly skilled areas? The transformation of the American economy is the key indicator here, I would say, in terms of the pull factor. It may be that there's not going to be that huge labor demand in agriculture and the services sector in the years to come that we saw in the past. So it's not just about where are the people coming from, are there enough babies being born, it's about are there the jobs there in the United States. I mean, I would argue that over the past 3 years, the biggest driver of the change in the movement of human beings across the continent has, of course, been the economy. I mean, there's been less jobs, and yes, it's been tougher to get across the border, and yes, there's been more of a clampdown, but essentially the jobs haven't been there. So people have either gone home or they've stopped coming. Mexico's economy improving has helped that to a certain degree, and I think this is where one of the next level of the debate really takes place, which is Mexico is always seen as being an expulsing country, a country that pushes out migrants. It's rapidly becoming a country which receives migrants. Mm-hmm. A lot of those Central Americans that make their way through Mexico are actually stopping in Mexico. A lot of those Central Americans actually find that Mexico is a place of opportunity for them. And as Mexico's economy develops, that's something which Mexico is going to have to grapple with in terms of, gosh, we all of a sudden have to deal with not just trans migrants passing through our country, but large numbers of people who want to settle in our country.
But that's why, as comprehensive immigration reform moves on Capitol Hill, the temporary worker component of the comprehensive bill is such a pivotal piece of the equation, because if you don't deal with future flows of workers, whether it's high skilled for Silicon Valley or for the Central Valley in California in the ag business, you're going to have a huge challenge, and you will have to sit down once the bill has been hammered and approved. You will have to sit down with countries like Mexico and others as to how you regulate these programs of future temporary flows of workers, because that's going to be a critical pivot. And I'm encouraged by the fact that this was one of the Gordian knots that could not be cut back in 2006 and 2007 between Labor and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And now we have a deal between AFL-CIO and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in providing a very delicate equilibrium in terms of how you regulate, control, administer a temporary worker program. And that piece is probably one of the most important components, and that's why it's so dangerous that as the bill moves to the House, there's an attempt in the House to cut the sausage into little pieces. Because if you break down each one of the components, then you've got nothing to entice and to bring in other constituencies that will be key to support that initiative if you don't bind them together and ensure that they may not get everything they're looking for, but there's something in it for them. And that's why the comprehensive approach is so important.
You like the Gang of Eight proposal?
Look, there are things...
Is it close to the ideal? You worked on this issue for all your life, basically.
There are things in the Gang of Eight proposal that I don't particularly like.
Like?
But I think this is the best bill possible that we have. What do I not like? That they've set up the border security triggers in such a way that they can become moving goalposts. if the government cannot guarantee 90% of operational control of the border, a commission will be appointed by Congress to determine how to reach that 90% operational control.
What do you say about what's your reaction, John, to this?
The component of border security cannot be underestimated in terms of its importance in getting the overall bill through. I mean, that is just the nature of American politics. You were talking a little bit earlier about, the idea of spillover border, and why is it such a political hot potato, not just along the border, but in other places. I mean, look, we saw the uptick even when the tragedy in Boston happened, where immediately there was a thought, good Lord, is, the fact that these two fellows, are related to Chechnya, is that going to torpedo it? And you saw some voices up on the Hill do it, and make those sort of assertions that, well, maybe we really ought to rethink this, because how did we miss these two bad apples in a barrel of 300 million plus people? My sense is that, the political sense is that this White House has done a very good job, but it has come, really, we've been doing this in the modern era since you were working with Jorge Castañeda back in 2000. I mean, this is still the same project. And we're only now getting to the delicate political equilibrium, and no State Department executive branch guy is ever going to comment publicly on the dynamics of my own legislative branch. But I will say that getting the border security piece of this right is essential to be able to push what most people, when I say most people, most of the Mexico-United States bilateral policy analysts consider to be the real meat of the reform, which is taking 11 million people out of the shadows, putting them into the economy, getting them working, getting them on payrolls, making sure that they are addressing the human tragedy of fractured families and things like that. But you've got to get that border security piece.
Let me ask you if you have any questions before we proceed. Is there any questions from the audience? Yes, right here. Yes, ma'am. The mic. Thank you.
I think this question is for Duncan. What do you consider essential for energy reform?
The essential pieces of the reform? That's very interesting.
Sure. So let's begin at the beginning. We have a national company in Mexico which is unable to exploit the resources that still are there under the Gulf of Mexico on land, etc. The way in which you need to, the first thing to do is actually to try to reform the national oil company to make it run more like a business. Right now, on any given year, Pemex pays more than 100% of its income in taxes. Which is a ridiculous situation. It means it hasn't have any money left with it to invest in the sector, in new technologies and in exploration and production. Secondly, you need to give Pemex more operational flexibility, which means that it should be allowed to enter into joint ventures with private firms that have the technology and have the expertise, more crucially, about getting into the deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. That will fundamentally change the equation, but it's not enough. The third level of the reform, I would say, has to be the creation of a regulator in Mexico that actually has the teeth and the resources to be able to establish a level playing field and to insist that Pemex as an operator, as well as any other operator that's there in the energy sector, abides by the rules and receives fair treatment. If you don't have those three crucial components, I don't think the energy reform actually flies.
Jorge?
Let me disagree with you. Finally, someone disagrees on the panel. I've been agreeing too much with everyone. So, I think that, in my opinion, I'm going to say something really controversial, but I don't think the energy reform passes by Pemex. I think they can pretty much leave Pemex as it is. I think that the issue with Pemex is that, as you say, the fiscal dependence of the government, the dependency of the government is way too high. So the issue is that in order to make that reform, then you need to do a fiscal reform. And that fiscal reform will need to be very deep because the tax collection in Mexico is extremely low. So in that sense, I think that what I was saying before is you need to have a capacity to prove to anyone that wants to establish industrial capacity in Mexico that they can have access to energy without relying on the government. In order to do that, you need basically three things. You need a capacity of private companies to invest in gas, in petrochemicals. I think that's highly desirable. And I think if we manage to see shale gas treated as with the kind of regulations that minerals are treated today, all these things require constitutional amendments. Again, it's easier said than done.
Incredibly difficult.
But I think those amendments would be much easier with these kind of objectives than to think that we would reform Pemex, because then you would have a huge opposition from the union. So I think that
But I think
would
it's
be
crucial
much more
here
pragmatic.
about Pemex. You know, I mean, I think everybody, all three major parties, recognize that Pemex needs to be reformed. It's not about privatization. That's the red herring that's been thrown out there. The government talks repeatedly about increasing private participation in the sector without privatizing either Mexican oil or the Mexican oil company. What does a lot of the Mexican public hear? They hear increased private participation equals privatization. It's a very difficult thing to explain to people, and not just your average person on the street, but to people in politics in Mexico.
But see, the three parties agree on reforming Pemex. But if you put in front of them what that means in terms of fiscal reform, I bet you neither one of the three wants it, because it's way too much what you have to reform. Now, the issue there becomes that I think that in politically, I think it'd be much easier to not get into Pemex. But on the other hand, I think that this has been very poorly sold to the Mexican people. I think there needs to be a much broader effort to explain what does it mean to have this capacity of private investment in Mexico. What does it mean for the average employment capacity? What does and I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Jorge, it's on a key point here about the messaging from the Mexican government. I was talking with a diputado friend of mine the other day, and he was making a joke about the way that politics works right now in Mexico, which is that the elites of the parties hash things out, then the message comes down to the rank or file, and they're told, vote on this within 5 to 7 days and don't move a comma. Now that's a real problem, because what we're going to see with the energy reform is that, you know, I'm an analyst, I study this full time in my job. I still don't know what the government actually intends to do. I'm guessing, I'm reading the messages, but there's been no clear statement. If the government decides to release a proposal and it's voted on within 7 days, that's not enough time to explain to people exactly why it's important. On the other hand, if you release it now and you wait for 6 months, that's plenty of time for the consensus that could be generated to fall apart. It's a very delicate balance that needs to be struck.
Now, one of the main issues that I think is going to come now is the Keystone Project. I think if the Keystone Project is done, that can have a huge impact on the price of Mexican oil. Because if you see where it goes, to the Gulf, where mainly they're buying Mexican oil, these refineries, I think that this can be a very big catalyst to force all these things. Because among other things, there you will still need a fiscal reform just because Pemex's revenues would fall dramatically. So I think we're about to see something big happen.
Next question. Thank you.
Sure. I'm with one of the Canadian pension funds here. I'm interested, you talked fairly concretely about what needs to be done in terms of energy policy and also security. But there's one question that was more or less glossed over, and I don't think it was intentional. You just moved on. It's corruption. So let's say a year from now, the momentum that is there, let's say we've done the right things on energy policy. Let's say we've seen progress in terms of security, domestic and foreign. What is the what significant measure is being taken in Mexico on corruption that would create that same momentum or that same sense that something is really going to change?
Arturo.
I think that the pieces have already been set in motion, and again, this is an issue that unfortunately is not going to transpire and is not going to gel overnight. 4 years ago, President Calderon, with the support of all of the parties in Congress, approved a landmark judicial reform bill, which is moving Mexico away from the old Napoleonic written trial system to an accusatorial trial system like the one that you have in the United States. Now, as all of you can understand, this may be starting to happen at the federal level, but before this starts trickling down to state and local level, we're in still for a long ride. But I think this reform could have one of the most salutary effects in terms of enhancing the rule of law, strengthening the judiciary, rooting out corruption that has existed in the judicial branch, bulletproofing judges, pun intended. This could be a very important piece of the equation, but it's going to take time. And it's going to take the sustained commitment of all stakeholders, from the private sector, from NGOs, from civil society, from federal, state, and local governments for this to really take root. But I think it's starting to move in that direction.
And
What is the time for you? Was it
I think
5 years, 10 years?
I think this is 10, 15 years.
Let me
America
also-
has been involved in this process.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let me say, I agree completely. First step is judicial reform. Very important, but 2016, when it's projected, or when they've given themselves to be able to come through, might have to be extended. Changing a justice system is changing the DNA of a society. Two other elements, education and civil society involvement. In the education aspect, I am hopeful. I mean, this will be something they will have to do, but in terms of education reforms, the very first thing that really has to change, and I know that, you know, this will be long and polemical, but, you know, your teachers have just got to get better at that young age. You've got to teach civics. In Canada, in the United States, you grew up, you were taught social values. You were taught about things. In Mexico, for the Mexicans in here, la ley de Herodes. Everybody knows this. You know how sort of things get done in your society. And the last part of it is the contribution and the link of that, and making sure that people understand the link to the rule of law. Part of Merida, and part of what we determined with the Mexicans we wanted to do, was to teach culture of lawfulness classes throughout Mexico. I think we're up to about 28 states now have, as a result of our bilateral cooperation, have courses that are taught in schools and out of schools, in youth centers, etc., on the culture of lawfulness, on the idea of collective values being more important than protecting your immediate family, on the idea of denouncing crime. Those sorts of things, I think. I agree it is a long-term prospect. One thing, though, that I think, if, again, coming back to my point, always look at the trend lines. Jorge Castaneda and Héctor Caimán wrote a book called Mañana o Pasado. And in that, they talk very well, I think, and very accurately about the difference between the culture of kleptocracy, where you have highest federal level type corruption with literally hundreds of millions of dollars, or corruption of the service window, corrupción de ventanilla, where if you're going to get your license, you're going to renew your permit to park your car, you've got to pay a little bit extra. That's the one that has to be attacked from the bottom up.
Your turn.
1 second. The other thing that is happening, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think the big issue is accountability. The other thing that is happening, and we just have seen in the last couple of months, is Twitter and Facebook. You saw two big events happen, well, in terms of recording public officials giving poverty funds for electoral purposes, created a mess. You just saw recently...
Or asking for a restaurant to be closed.
Exactly, that was my second example. A woman
That
was
was
the
horrible.
daughter of someone has to with
Of
how
an
do you say
official.
of an official wanting to shut down a restaurant, and everyone taped it, and it became a gigantic embarrassment for these people.
He's about to lose his job, I hope.
So I think this is happening more and more, and I think it's the Moises Naim theory. I think this means empowerment, and I think people are becoming empowered.
I think this is a very interesting point. If I lived in Mexico for 17 years before I moved to DC in December. In that time, I saw things change so fundamentally in terms of what was going on with the levels of corruption. There's corruption everywhere, okay? All throughout Mexican society, of course it's there. But you find it in the United States, you find it in Great Britain, you find it in France. I mean, it's a common phenomenon around the world. The question is, are things getting better? And I perceived it in my time in Mexico, that particularly at the high levels, there was less corruption. At the level of the federal government, there were much stronger controls than there were before. The challenge now, I would say, is to bring it down to the state and the municipal level. And that's really where you're going to find more net benefits for the average person in Mexican society.
That about wraps it up. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for a very interesting, lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.